The Mojave Desert did not forgive, and it did not forget. It was a crucible of baked earth, cracked rock, and merciless sunlight, a place where weakness was burned away before it could take root. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the ambient temperature hovered at 112 degrees. The heat radiating from the hardpan floor distorted the horizon into a shimmering, liquid mirage. Blythe Stanhope lay perfectly still. She was a ghost in the wasteland, buried beneath a ghillie suit constructed of frayed burlap, dried sagebrush, and Mojave dust. She had been in this firing position for 14 hours. She had not moved, had not spoken, and had barely consumed an ounce of tepid water from her hydration bladder. Her breathing was a slow, deliberate rhythm, a metronome set to the beating of her own heart. Before her rested the Barrett M107A1. It was not the newest rifle in the military's inventory. It did not have a carbon fiber barrel or a Bluetooth-enabled scope. It was a heavy, brutal instrument of forged steel and Parkerized metal, chambered in the devastating .50 BMG. It was a weapon from an era that demanded physical strength and mechanical mastery, an analog beast in a world increasingly obsessed with digital crutches. Blythe preferred it that way. She trusted steel. She trusted gravity. She trusted the math she calculated in her own head. She did not trust microchips. Her right eye, pressed against the rubber cup of the optic, surveyed the target area. 1,400 yards downrange, a rusted, corrugated metal shack sat at the edge of a dry lake bed. Next to it, 2 black SUVs were parked at jagged angles. Men stood around the vehicles, their silhouettes dancing in the heat distortion. They were heavily armed, moving with the arrogant swagger of men who believed they were untouchable. They were brokers, merchants of death dealing in stolen military ordnance. The primary target was a man in a white linen suit, currently gesturing toward an open crate in the back of the lead SUV. 1,400 yards, 4,200 feet. In modern warfare, a sniper would rely on a spotter equipped with a Kestrel environmental meter, a laser rangefinder, and a ballistic calculator installed on a ruggedized smartphone. They would input the data, let the algorithm do the thinking, and adjust the dials accordingly. Blythe worked alone. She always worked alone. And she did not use algorithms. She relied on the lessons etched into her mind by her father, Silas Stanhope. Silas, known to the men who bled beside him as Reaper, was a relic of a colder, harder war. He had taught her that electronics fail when the blood and the dirt start flying. He taught her that a true marksman relies on the fundamentals: sight picture, trigger control, and an intimate, almost spiritual understanding of the environment. Blythe looked away from the target and studied the desert between her muzzle and the shack. She was not looking at the dirt, she was looking at the air. Wind is the invisible enemy of the long-range shooter. At 1,400 yards, a bullet is in the air for nearly 2.5 seconds. In that time, even a gentle breeze can push a massive .50 caliber projectile several feet off its intended path. Blythe watched the mirage. The heat waves were rolling from left to right, leaning at a slight angle. She shifted her gaze to a patch of dry mesquite brush halfway downrange. The brittle branches trembled, dipping steadily eastward. 7 miles per hour, full value crosswind from the 9 o'clock position. She reached up with a gloved hand and adjusted the windage turret on her scope. 2 clicks. The mechanical clicks were sharp, precise, and satisfying. Next was elevation. The target was slightly below her current position on the ridge. She factored in the barometric pressure, the humidity, and the blistering temperature, which would cause the bullet to fly faster and hit higher. She made the calculations in her head, pulling numbers from a dope book she had memorized years ago. Finally, she accounted for the Coriolis effect. The Earth was spinning beneath her. In the 2.5 seconds her bullet would spend in flight, the planet would physically rotate, moving the target away from the crosshairs. It was a microscopic adjustment, the kind of variable that separated a good shooter from a legend. She turned the elevation dial. 4 clicks. She settled back behind the scope. The crosshairs rested not on the man in the white suit, but on a patch of empty air above and to his left. She was not aiming at where he was. She was aiming at where the bullet and the man would intersect in the future. Her finger grazed the curved steel of the trigger. She did not rest it there. That was another lesson from Silas. You do not touch the trigger until you have made the conscious decision to end a life. Blythe closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She slowed her heart rate, 60 beats per minute, 55, 50. She opened her eyes. The target stopped moving. He stood perfectly still, turning his head to spit into the dust. It was time. Blythe exhaled, releasing the air from her lungs until she reached the natural respiratory pause. That fleeting moment of absolute stillness between breaths. Her finger slid onto the trigger. She did not pull it. She applied steady, incremental rearward pressure, letting the brakes surprise her. The rifle roared. The sound was a physical blow, a thunderclap that shattered the desert silence. The massive recoil drove the buttstock into her shoulder like a sledgehammer, but she rode the violence perfectly, keeping her eye glued to the scope, watching her trace. Through the optics, she saw the bullet's wake, a swirling vortex in the heated air, arcing high above the desert floor before beginning its catastrophic descent. 1 second, 2 seconds, impact. The man in the white suit folded instantly, dropping to the dirt without a sound, his body turning off like a flip switch. The men around him scrambled, raising their weapons, looking wildly for an enemy they could not see and could not hear, because the sound of the gunshot had not even reached them yet. Blythe did not stay to watch the panic. She cycled the heavy bolt of the Barrett, ejecting the spent brass casing. It hit the sun-baked rock with a sharp, ringing chime. She caught the brass, slipped it into her pocket, and began to break down the weapon. The job was done. It was time to become a ghost again. 4 hours later, the blistering heat of the Mojave was replaced by the cool, salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean. Blythe sat in the back of a sterile, unmarked transport van as it cleared the heavily fortified gates of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The base was a sprawling complex of concrete, steel, and manicured lawns, the beating heart of naval special warfare on the West Coast. She wore a clean set of utility fatigues. Her blonde hair, normally tied back in a tight regulation bun, was slightly damp from a quick field shower, though she could still smell the cordite and desert dust lingering on her skin. She carried a heavy olive-drab pelican case containing the disassembled Barrett. She walked with a purposeful, measured stride toward the armory. Sailors and junior officers parted ways for her, offering nods of respect or casting curious glances. At 28 years old, Blythe Stanhope carried an aura of quiet, dangerous competence. She did not boast. She did not drink at the local bars and tell war stories. She simply did the work, outperforming men twice her size on the obstacle courses, the ranges, and in the kill houses. She reached the armory, swiped her access card, and stepped into the familiar, comforting atmosphere of the weapons vault. The air here was heavily air-conditioned and smelled strongly of hops, number 9 solvent, gun oil, and cold steel. It was the scent of discipline. She set the Pelican case on a steel workbench, opened it, and began the meticulous ritual of cleaning her weapon. She stripped the bolt carrier group, inspecting the locking lugs for microfractures. She ran a brass brush soaked in solvent down the massive bore, pushing out the carbon fouling. She was deep into the process, finding a meditative peace in the mechanical repetition, when the heavy steel door of the armory swung open. Blythe did not look up immediately. She continued wiping down the bolt with a lint-free cloth. But her situational awareness, honed razor-sharp by years in the shadows, registered the heavy, synchronized thud of combat boots. Not one person. 4. Petty Officer Stanhope. The voice was hard, authoritative, and laced with tension. Blythe slowly set the bolt down on the rag. She turned. 4 master-at-arms stood inside the vault. They were military police, heavily built, their faces unreadable masks of professional detachment. Unlike the usual base security patrols who carried their sidearms holstered and locked, these men had their hands resting deliberately on the grips of their Sig Sauer M18s. Their posture was aggressive. They were treating her not as a fellow sailor, but as a high-threat hostile. "I am currently securing a sensitive weapons system," Blythe said, her voice completely level. It betrayed no surprise, no fear. "Step away from the workbench, Stanhope," the lead MA commanded. He took a half-step forward, his thumb hovering over the retention hood of his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Blythe looked at the men. She could have killed all four of them before they cleared leather. It was a simple, tactical calculus. The distances, the angles, the reaction times. But she was a professional. She respected the uniform, even when the men wearing it were making a mistake. She deliberately placed her hands on the edge of the steel table, palms down. "What is the nature of this interruption?" she asked. "You are being detained under suspicion of violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically Article 106A, espionage." The lead MA pulled a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Treason. Espionage. The words hung in the cold, oily air of the armory. They were the absolute worst accusations a warfighter could face. To be accused of selling out the country you had sworn to defend, the country you had bled for, was an insult that cut deeper than any knife. Blythe did not argue. She did not ask questions. She knew that the men standing before her were simply dogs on a leash, following orders handed down from much higher up the chain. Arguing with them was pointless. She turned around slowly, offering no sudden movements, and placed her wrists together at the small of her back. The cold steel of the cuffs ratcheted tight around her wrists, biting into the skin. It was a profound physical indignity, an erasure of her agency and her rank. "Walk," the MA ordered, grabbing her by the bicep. They marched her out of the armory and into the bright California sunlight. It was the middle of the afternoon. The base was busy. Hundreds of sailors, officers, and civilian contractors stopped what they were doing to watch. The silence that fell over the courtyard was deafening. They watched a woman who had broken records on the rifle range, a woman whose physical endurance was legendary, being paraded across the asphalt like a common criminal. Blythe kept her head up. She locked her eyes straight ahead, staring at the horizon. She did not look at the ground. She did not show shame. Her face was carved from granite. Let them look. Let them whisper. She knew her own honor, and she would not let them see her break. They marched her toward Building 7. Building 7 was a squat, windowless concrete bunker of a structure that housed the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and military intelligence detachments. It was a place where careers went to die, where secrets were extracted in cold, soundproof rooms under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. They led her through a labyrinth of heavily secured corridors, past steel doors requiring biometric scans, until they reached Interrogation Room 3. The door opened. They pushed her inside. The room was Spartan, a steel table bolted to the floor, two metal chairs, a mirrored glass window taking up half the right wall. The air conditioning was cranked so high the room felt like a meat locker. It was a classic psychological tactic, designed to make the suspect physically uncomfortable, to make them shiver, to make them feel small and vulnerable. Blythe stood in the center of the room. She did not shiver. Behind the steel table sat a man who did not belong in the modern Navy. He was in his mid-60s, his face a landscape of deep lines and weathered skin that spoke of decades spent under hostile suns. His hair was iron gray, cropped close to the scalp in an immaculate high and tight. He wore the khaki uniform of a senior officer, the collar bearing the silver eagles of a colonel. His chest was covered in a massive stack of ribbons, but Blythe's eyes went immediately to the ones that mattered. A silver star, a bronze star with a V device for valor, and the Purple Heart. This was a man who had earned his rank in blood, not in boardrooms. He belonged to a generation that fought the Cold War, a generation that stood staring across the Fulda Gap, waiting for Soviet tanks, a generation that bled in the ruins of Beirut and the jungles of Central America. He looked at her with eyes that were as cold and unforgiving as a winter ocean. "Sit," he commanded. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded instant obedience. Blythe remained standing. "I prefer to stand, sir." The colonel's eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic assessment of her defiance. He did not yell. He did not pound the table. He simply waited, letting the silence stretch, trying to see who would break first. Blythe held his gaze. She recognized the type. He was a predator, an apex operator who had survived his wars by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than the enemy. But Blythe had been raised by a man just like him. She knew how to play this game. "I am Colonel Alistair Cromwell," the man finally said, leaning back in his metal chair. "I am the senior intelligence officer for this installation, and you are Petty Officer Blythe Stanhope. Outstanding service record, flawless marksmanship scores, commendations from every commanding officer you've ever served under." He picked up a manila folder from the table and let it drop with a heavy thud. "A perfect sailor on paper," Cromwell continued, "but my experience has taught me that paper is a shield people use to hide their true nature." "My nature is to follow orders and eliminate targets, sir," Blythe said, her voice steady. Cromwell let out a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh. "Is it? Then explain this." He reached into his pocket and placed an object on the center of the steel table. It was a small, ruggedized USB drive encased in matte black rubber. It sat there under the harsh lights, an innocuous piece of plastic and silicon that possessed the power to destroy her life. "That was recovered from your personal footlocker in the barracks during a random security sweep exactly 45 minutes ago," Cromwell said, his eyes drilling into hers. "Do you deny that it was in your locker?" "I have never seen that drive before in my life, sir." "A predictable answer," Cromwell replied smoothly. "Unfortunately for you, our forensic technicians have already run a preliminary scan. You know what they found?" Blythe said nothing. She maintained eye contact. "They found the mother loads, Stanhope. Satellite telemetry data for our Pacific Fleet movements. Classified deployment schedules for Carrier Strike Group 9, and encryption keys for our secure communication networks. Enough intelligence to compromise the entire West Coast defensive posture, and it was sitting under your dress blues." "I am being framed, Colonel." "By who?" Cromwell fired back, his voice rising in volume for the first time. "Who has the clearance, the access, and the motive to plant highly classified intelligence in the locker of an enlisted sniper? Are you telling me there's a conspiracy against you? Because from where I sit, it looks like a textbook case of an operative preparing to sell out her country to the highest bidder." Blythe's jaw tightened. The anger was there, a hot ember in her chest, but she locked it down behind years of mental conditioning. "I don't care how it looks, sir. I care about the truth. I am an analog operator. I don't use digital drives. I don't download files. If I want to remember something, I memorize it. If someone put that drive in my locker, they made a mistake. Because anyone who actually knows my operational profile knows I despise digital storage." Cromwell stared at her. The silence returned, thick and heavy. Then slowly the hard lines of the colonel's face shifted. The predatory aggression faded, replaced by something far more calculating, something almost akin to respect. He reached out, picked up the black USB drive, and tossed it into the metal wastebasket beside his chair. Blythe blinked, masking her surprise. "You're right," Cromwell said quietly. "It was a mistake." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the steel table, steepling his fingers. "I put that drive in your locker, Stanhope." Blythe went perfectly still. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Sir?" The drive I just threw in the trash is a dummy. It's loaded with white noise and fake telemetry. I authorized a discreet penetration test of the barracks' security protocols this morning. I had my men plant that dummy drive in your locker to test our internal sweeps and to test you. I wanted to see how the base's golden girl reacted when backed into a corner. Cromwell's eyes darkened, the shadow of something deeply troubling crossing his features. But that's not why you're here. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, transparent plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was another USB drive. This one was silver, encased in brushed aircraft-grade aluminum. It looked heavy. It looked old. He set the bag on the table. When the master-at-arms breached your locker to retrieve my dummy drive, Cromwell said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial murmur, they didn't find it. My dummy drive was gone. Instead, they found this. He tapped the plastic bag with a thick, scarred finger. I didn't plant this, Stanhope, and my technicians didn't find fleet telemetry on it. What is it? Blythe asked, the first hint of genuine unease creeping into her voice. It's a ghost, Cromwell said. It's a digital relic from a war that officially ended 30 years ago. The encryption on this drive is a proprietary cipher used by the Department of Defense in the late 1980s. It took my best people half an hour just to recognize the code, let alone crack it. Cromwell stood up from the table. He began to pace the small room, his boots clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor. When they finally broke through the outer layer, they found coordinates, access codes, protocols for Operation Iron Shield. Do you know what that is, Petty Officer? No, sir. I didn't think so. You weren't even born yet. Cromwell stopped pacing and looked at the mirrored glass, as if addressing unseen listeners, before turning back to Blythe. During the height of the Cold War, the United States military established a network of black site armories hidden across the globe. Caches of untraceable, devastating analog weaponry. No GPS trackers, no biometric locks. Weapons designed to be used if the communication grids went down and the world burned. Operation Iron Shield. Cromwell looked down at the silver drive. Those sites were supposed to be decommissioned in 1994. The locations were scrubbed, but the codes on this drive? They are active decryption keys for 3 of those black sites. Weapons that don't exist, stockpiled in locations that aren't on any map. He stepped close to Blythe. He was a tall man, imposing, carrying the weight of command. Someone removed my dummy drive. Someone bypassed 3 layers of biometric security in the barracks, cracked your personal locker, and planted active Cold War encryption keys in your gear. And then they triggered a tip to NCIS. Blythe processed the tactical data with machine-like efficiency. Someone is trying to frame me for treason, but they aren't using modern intel. They are using legacy intelligence, which means whoever is setting me up is highly placed, and they've been around a long time. Exactly, Cromwell whispered. Someone with stars on their collar wants you gone, Stanhope. They want you locked in a dark hole in Leavenworth, or they want you executed. They use this drive to force my hand. By protocol, because this drive contains active Tier 1 strategic intelligence, I am required to detain you, strip you of your rank, and hand you over to federal intelligence agencies where you will disappear. Are you going to do that, Colonel? Cromwell's jaw tightened. He looked at her, searching her face, looking for the lie, looking for the weakness. He found neither. I despise the modern military machine, Stanhope, Cromwell said, his voice laced with bitter conviction. I despise the politicians who run wars from iPads. I despise the reliance on drones and algorithms over the judgment of a trained warfighter. I read your file. You are a throwback. You rely on iron sights, wind, and math. You are a true operator. I respect that. He took a step back. But respect doesn't override protocol. I have a chain of command to answer to. I have unseen eyes watching this room right now. You are in possession of strategic materials. Before I decide whether to bury you or help you, I need to know exactly who and what I am dealing with. Cromwell hit a button on the comms panel embedded in the wall. Sergeant Major Greer, enter the room. The heavy steel door opened. A female military police officer stepped inside. She was built like a heavyweight boxer, her face a rigid mask of duty. "Sir," Greer said, snapping a crisp salute. "The suspect is accused of Tier 1 espionage," Cromwell stated, his voice reverting to the cold, formal tone of a commanding officer. "Execute a full Level 4 contraband search." Greer's eyes flicked to Blythe. "Yes, sir." A Level 4 search. A full strip search. It was the ultimate psychological weapon in the interrogator's arsenal, designed to strip away the suspect's dignity, to leave them completely exposed and vulnerable before the questioning resumed. "Turn around, uncuff her, and step back," Cromwell ordered Greer. Greer complied, unlocking the steel cuffs. Blythe brought her hands forward, rubbing the raw, red indentations on her wrists. "Remove your uniform, petty officer," Greer commanded, her voice devoid of any emotion. Blythe did not hesitate. She did not beg. She did not look away in shame. She knew that showing weakness in this room was a death sentence. Her honor was not attached to the fabric on her back. It was forged in the fire of her spirit. She met Cromwell's eyes directly. She held his gaze as her hands moved to the buttons of her utility blouse. Her movements were precise, efficient, and entirely devoid of fear. She unbuttoned the blouse and let it drop to the concrete floor. She stood in her olive-drab undershirt. "Continue," Greer said. Blythe pulled the undershirt over her head. She stood before the two senior enlisted personnel in a plain, functional sports bra and her utility trousers. The harsh, fluorescent lighting cast no shadows, illuminating every inch of exposed skin. Cromwell, who had been watching with clinical detachment, suddenly went rigid. The breath caught in his throat. He was not looking at her with the eyes of an interrogator anymore. He was looking at a map of a war that did not officially exist. Blythe's torso was a canvas of violence. Her skin, though tanned and heavily muscled, was marred by a history of brutal, undocumented combat. There was a jagged, starburst scar on her right shoulder, the unmistakable signature of shrapnel from a close proximity blast. A long, smooth burn mark ran down the inside of her left forearm, the kind left by the searing heat of a machine gun barrel during a frantic firefight. Her collarbone showed the slight, unnatural thickening of a bone that had been shattered and healed under less than ideal medical conditions. These were not the scars of a sailor who spent her time scanning radar screens on a guided missile destroyer. These were the scars of an operator who lived, bled, and killed in the dirt. But it was not the scars that made the blood drain from Colonel Cromwell's face. "Turn to your right," Greer ordered. Blythe pivoted perfectly on her heel. On the left side of her rib cage, stark black ink stood out against her skin. It was a tattoo. Cromwell took a step forward, his eyes wide, his disciplined composure shattering completely. The tattoo was intricate and flawless. It depicted the golden eagle clutching an anchor, a trident, and a flintlock pistol, the sacred, heavily guarded emblem of the United States Navy SEALs. To wear that emblem without earning it was a sacrilege that would invite the wrath of the entire Special Operations community. But a woman could not officially earn it. Women were not permitted in the SEAL teams. Yet, there it was, inked into her ribs. But there was more. Below the trident, etched in bold Roman numerals, was the number 7. Team 7. The ghost team. The myth. The rumor whispered in the darkest corners of JSOC bars by men who had drank too much and seen too much. An off-the-books, completely unsanctioned unit composed entirely of female operators, utilized for missions so politically toxic, so deeply embedded in denied areas that the U.S. government could never risk sending traditional assets. Cromwell's mind raced back 30 years. Beirut, 1983. The barracks bombing, the smoke, the screaming, the blood and the dust. He had been a young lieutenant, pinned down under a collapsed concrete beam, waiting to die. and then a shadow had moved through the smoke. A man with eyes like ice and a suppressed rifle, cutting through the enemy fighters with surgical, terrifying precision. The man had dragged Cromwell from the rubble, saving his life. That man was Master Chief Silas Stanhope, call sign Reaper. Years later, before Silas supposedly died in a classified operation, he had come to Cromwell. He had spoken of the changing nature of war. He had spoken of the need for a new kind of weapon. A team of ghosts who could move where men could not, who could strike without leaving a footprint, who relied on the old ways of war. Team 7. Cromwell stared at the tattoo on Blythe's ribs. The trident. The 7. Sergeant Major Greer, Cromwell said. His voice was no longer a bark of command. It was a hoarse, hollow whisper. Sir, step outside. Secure the corridor. Nobody enters this room. Cut the recording feeds. Greer hesitated, sensing the massive shift in the room's dynamic. Sir, protocol dictates. I don't give a damn about protocol, Sergeant Major, Cromwell roared, the sudden explosion of volume echoing violently off the concrete walls. Get out of this room and cut the feeds, now! Yes, sir. Greer turned on her heel and practically ran from the room, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind her, the magnetic locks engaging with a heavy clunk. Cromwell stood alone in the room with Blythe. He stared at her ribcage, then slowly brought his eyes up to meet hers. Blythe had not moved. She stood perfectly still, her chin elevated, her eyes locking onto his with absolute, unflinching resolve. She knew what he was looking at. She knew what it meant to him. Silas, Cromwell whispered, the name carrying the weight of 100 buried ghosts. You are Silas's girl. Master Chief Silas Stanhope was my father, Colonel, Blythe said, her voice quiet but ringing with pride in the silent room. He trained me. He forged me. He taught me the old ways. And before he died, he gave me this command. Cromwell raised a shaking hand and rubbed his jaw. He looked like a man who had just watched a ghost walk out of a grave. The rumors, he muttered. I thought he was crazy. I thought it was just whiskey talk. An all-female operational unit operating completely off the grid. No digital footprint. No official oversight. The ultimate analog weapon in a digital war. We exist, Colonel. We are the ghosts of honor. We do the work the politicians are too afraid to authorize, and we do not leave a trace. Cromwell looked at the silver USB drive sitting on the table. The active decryption keys for the Cold War black sites. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in the old colonel's mind. Sterling, Cromwell said, his eyes hardening, the shock fading into a cold, murderous clarity. Sir? Vice Admiral Thaddeus Sterling, Cromwell said, pacing back to the table. He is the Deputy Commander of Naval Intelligence. He is a bureaucrat, a politician in a uniform. He has been pushing for years to replace human operators with autonomous drone swarms and AI predictive combat modeling. He hates the analog warfighter. He views them as liabilities. Cromwell picked up the silver drive. Sterling has the clearance to access these old Iron Shield codes. If Sterling is moving these weapons, selling them, or using them to fund his autonomous warfare projects, your team is the only threat to him. You operate off the grid. His AI cannot predict you. His satellites cannot track you because you don't carry the beacons. He looked at Blythe, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce loyalty. The loyalty of the old guard. Sterling planted this drive, Cromwell said. He knows your team exists, and he knows he can't fight you in the shadows. So he is trying to drag you into the light. He is using my NCIS unit as a weapon to destroy Silas's legacy. Blythe reached down, picked up her undershirt, and pulled it back over her head. She picked up her utility blouse and began to button it, her movements calm and deliberate. He made a mistake, Colonel, Blythe said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. He tried to trap a ghost in a cage. Cromwell watched her dress. He saw the way she moved, the supreme confidence, the sheer, undeniable confidence. He saw his old friend Silas standing before him. The Cold War veteran made his decision. He would not let the digital bureaucrats destroy the last true warriors. Blythe, Cromwell said, using her first name for the first time. Sterling owns the system. He owns the satellites, the drones, the digital infrastructure. If you walk out of this room, you are a dead woman. The entire apparatus of the United States military intelligence community will hunt you. Blythe finished buttoning her blouse. She smoothed the fabric, adjusting her collar, restoring her uniform to perfect military regulation. She looked at the old colonel, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "Let them hunt, Colonel," Blythe Stanhope said. "They rely on batteries. Batteries die. I don't." Cromwell smiled. It was a grim, wolfish smile. The smile of a man who was finally going back to war. "All right, Wraith," Cromwell said, using her call sign. "Let's teach these bureaucrats how the old guard fights." The air inside the underground firing range beneath Naval Base Coronado tasted of lead, vaporized copper, and stale circulated oxygen. It was a subterranean concrete tube stretching exactly 1,000 yards into the dark earth, a place where the modern Navy tested its most classified ballistic technologies. Colonel Alistair Cromwell stood behind the firing line, his arms crossed over his chest, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh glare of overhead halogen panels. He had bypassed 3 levels of security to bring Blythe Stanhope down here, operating strictly off the books. Down the line, a squad of Naval Special Warfare snipers lay prone on their shooting mats. They were young men, heavily muscled and covered in the latest tactical nylon. Attached to their rifles were optical systems that looked more like aerospace computers than rifle scopes. Digital rangefinders pinged invisible lasers downrange. Small meteorological stations clipped to their tripods fed real-time data via Bluetooth into ballistic solvers on their wrist-mounted screens. The scopes themselves featured heads-up displays, projecting algorithmic firing solutions directly into their reticles. They were not aiming, they were simply aligning a digital crosshair where a microchip told them to. Cromwell watched them with undisguised contempt. He turned his head to look at Blythe. She stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed but coiled, like a predator resting in the shade. In her hand, she held a weapon Cromwell had pulled from his own private armory cache. It was an M14 National Match rifle. It had a heavy walnut stock, a Parkerized steel barrel, and absolutely zero electronics. It did not even have a scope. It was equipped only with National Match iron sights, a rear peep, and a front post. It was a rifle from an era when a soldier had to understand the math of the universe to hit a target. "The men on that line represent the future Vice Admiral Sterling is building," Cromwell said, his voice a low, gravel rumble over the muffled thumps of suppressed gunfire. "They are system operators. If you take away their batteries, they are blind. Sterling wants to replace human instinct with artificial intelligence. He believes the analog warfighter is obsolete." Blythe looked at the young snipers. She saw them checking their screens after every shot, adjusting their dials based on digital prompts rather than feeling the shift in the atmospheric pressure or reading the mirage. "Technology creates a false sense of security, Colonel," Blythe said quietly. "It makes men lazy. When the screen goes black, they forget how to fight." "Prove it," Cromwell challenged. He stepped up to the line control console and pressed the intercom button. His voice boomed out over the range speakers, demanding immediate attention. "Cease fire. Clear and lock all weapons. Step back from the line." The young snipers hesitated, looking at the colonel in confusion, but the rank on his collar brokered no argument. They dropped their magazines, locked their bolts to the rear, and stepped back. The lead shooter, a petty officer first class with a smug expression and a rifle that cost more than a sports car, looked at Blythe and the wooden relic in her hands with open amusement. Cromwell pointed down the concrete tunnel. Target stands at 800 yards. The ventilation system in this tunnel creates an artificial, unpredictable crosswind that varies from 3 to 12 miles per hour across different zones of the trajectory. Petty officer, your digital solver just calculated the wind value. What is it? The young sniper tapped his wrist monitor. Algorithm says holding 1.2 mils left will guarantee a center mass impact, sir. Cromwell turned to Blythe. Wraith, 800 yards, iron sights, no spotter, no screens, one shot. Blythe did not say a word. She stepped up to the firing line. She did not lay down on a padded mat. She dropped into a high kneeling position, wrapping the leather sling tightly around her left bicep to create a bone-supported structural lock. She brought the heavy walnut stock to her cheek. 800 yards is nearly half a mile. To the naked eye, the target was smaller than the head of a pin. Through the rear peep sight, it was barely a speck of dust sitting on top of the front steel post. She tuned out the young snipers. She tuned out the humming of the fluorescent lights. She focused entirely on the air moving through the tunnel. She watched the dust motes dancing in the beams of light. She felt the subtle chill of the artificial wind against the exposed skin of her neck. The wind was not constant. It was a river with fast currents and slow eddies. She did the math. Gravity, bullet weight, muzzle velocity. She calculated the varied wind zones, blending them into a single, intuitive hold-off. Her finger found the trigger. She breathed in, drawing the stale air deep into her lungs, and let it out slowly. She found the pause. She squeezed. The M14 barked, a sharp, mechanical crack that echoed violently in the concrete tube. The heavy .308 caliber bullet tore down the range. Cromwell had his spotting scope trained on the target. For 2 seconds, there was nothing. Then, a perfect, clean hole punched directly through the dead center of the black X-ring. Cromwell lowered his head from the spotting scope. He looked at the young sniper with the digital watch. "Your algorithm was wrong, son," Cromwell said coldly. "The wind shifted halfway down the tunnel. If you had trusted your screen, you would have missed by 6 inches. She trusted her instincts. She hit dead center." The young men stared at Blythe in stunned silence as she calmly lowered the rifle, caught the ejected brass casing out of the air, and cleared the chamber. "The machine tells you what should happen," Cromwell said to the squad, his voice dripping with the hard-earned wisdom of the Cold War. "The warfighter feels what is actually happening." Dismissed. As the squad packed their gear in humbled silence, Cromwell led Blythe toward the heavily secured elevator at the rear of the range. The demonstration was over. The point was made. Now, they had a war to plan. 2 hours later, they sat in a windowless SCIF, a sensitive, compartmented information facility deep inside the base. The walls were lined with copper mesh to prevent electronic eavesdropping. The only light came from the glow of a single, secured laptop resting on a steel table. Cromwell had inserted the silver Cold War USB drive into an isolated terminal. The screen displayed rows of heavily encrypted data, manifesting as green text scrolling over a black background. "Thaddeus Sterling," Cromwell said, pointing a thick finger at the screen. "He has spent the last decade positioning himself at the nexus of naval intelligence and autonomous weapons development. He is the architect behind the Drone Swarm Initiative, but Congress keeps cutting his funding. They don't trust machines to make kill decisions." Blythe studied the scrolling data. "So he found alternative funding." "Exactly," Cromwell nodded. "The Cold War black sites, Operation Iron Shield. These sites contain thousands of tons of untraceable analog weapons, Soviet-era RPGs, unmarked C4 plastic explosives, small arms without serial numbers, weapons designed to fuel proxy wars that never happen." Cromwell tapped a specific line of code. "Sterling is using his automated logistics drones to quietly empty these bunkers. He is selling the Iron Shield stockpiles to rogue military factions and using the dark money to secretly fund his AI combat programs. He is building his own private, autonomous army within the Navy, and Team 7 is the only variable his machines cannot account for, Blythe realized. You are ghosts, Cromwell confirmed. Sterling's entire security apparatus relies on tracking cellular signals, GPS beacons, and digital footprints. Your team operates entirely off the grid. You communicate via burst transmission shortwave radios. You navigate by map and compass. You don't exist on his screens. To an AI, something that cannot be tracked is a fatal anomaly. Sterling framed you to bring you into the light so his system could finally target you. Blythe felt a cold, familiar calm settle over her. It was the absolute clarity that came right before a mission. He made a tactical error, Blythe said, her voice devoid of emotion. He assumed framing me would paralyze the team. He assumed we operate like a conventional unit that breaks down when the chain of command is disrupted. Where is your team right now? Cromwell asked. They are waiting for my signal. The signal did not come across a secure satellite phone. It came via a coded, classified ad placed in the back pages of a local San Diego newspaper. A method so archaic and obsolete that no modern signals intelligence algorithm would ever flag it. 36 hours later, Blythe Stanhope stood on the porch of a decaying, abandoned logging cabin high in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The air here was thin, biting cold, and smelled sharply of pine needles and wood smoke. The cabin was miles away from the nearest paved road, invisible from the air under the thick canopy of ancient redwoods. Inside the cabin, the remaining 4 members of Team 7 were gearing up in near-total silence. The camaraderie among them was not built on loud jokes or bravado. It was a silent, unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of denied operations. They were women who had been erased from official records, living in the shadows, fighting wars the public would never know about. Rowena, the heavy weapons specialist, was methodically checking the action of a Mark 48 machine gun. Tamsin, the team's explosives expert, was carefully wrapping det cord around blocks of C4, her hands steady and precise. Greer, the infiltrator, was sharpening a combat knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound in the room. And then there was Darby. Darby was Blythe's second-in-command. She was a brilliant tactical mind, fiercely loyal, but lately Blythe had noticed a shadow in her eyes. The strain of being a ghost was wearing on her. Darby wanted a life. She wanted a pension. She wanted a name that meant something outside of a classified briefing room. Blythe walked into the cabin, pulling the heavy wooden door shut against the mountain chill. She looked at her team. "Status," Blythe demanded softly. "Perimeter is set," Darby replied, not looking up from her rifle magazine. "Tripwires at 50 and 100 yards. Analog triggers. No electronic sensors." "Sterling knows we didn't go into custody," Blythe said, addressing the room. "He knows NCIS lost me, which means he knows his frame job failed. He will send his own people. He won't use Navy SEALs or conventional forces. He will use Titan Shield." Titan Shield was a private military corporation operating entirely in the gray zone. They recruited exclusively from Tier 1 Special Operations units. They were heavily armed, highly motivated by massive paychecks, and equipped with the most advanced combat technology money could buy. "They will come at night," Blythe continued. "They will rely on thermal optics, quad-tube night vision, and Overwatch drones. They will expect us to be blind." Blythe picked up a bucket of thick, wet mountain mud from the floor. She plunged her hands into it. "We fight the way Reaper taught us. We strip away their advantages. We become the mountain." She began to smear the freezing mud over her face, her neck, and her arms. The mud would dry, forming a thermal barrier that would mask her body heat from the enemy's infrared sensors. The rest of the team wordlessly followed suit, transforming themselves from human soldiers into primal, earthen shadows. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Sierras, plunging the forest into absolute, suffocating darkness. They did not have to wait long. At exactly 0200 hours, the ambient noise of the forest abruptly vanished. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Then came the sound. It was a high-pitched electronic whine, barely perceptible to the human ear. "Overwatch drone," Tamsin whispered, her voice barely a breath. Blythe signaled with a flat hand. "Hold position." Through the gaps in the cabin's wooden floorboards, they watched the forest. 500 yards out, the faint, unnatural glow of infrared lasers cut through the trees. Titan Shield had arrived. There were 12 of them. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized fluidity of apex predators. They wore advanced tactical helmets equipped with panoramic night vision goggles, turning the pitch-black forest into a glowing green landscape. They carried suppressed submachine guns and communicated via encrypted throat mics. They believed they owned the night. They did not realize they were walking into a graveyard. Blythe waited until the point man crossed the invisible threshold she had mentally established at the tree line. She raised a single finger. Tamsin pulled a physical, braided nylon cord. 50 yards away, the analog trap sprang. It was not a complex electronic explosive. It was a simple shotgun primer rigged to a spring-loaded mousetrap, attached to a cluster of magnesium flares hidden in the canopy. The primer snapped. The flares ignited. The forest was instantly bathed in a blinding, searing white light, burning with the intensity of a miniature sun. For the Titan Shield mercenaries wearing night vision goggles, the sudden introduction of millions of candle power was catastrophic. The digital tubes in their optics overloaded, washing their vision in an agonizing sea of blinding white. Men screamed, tearing the expensive helmets from their heads, temporarily blinded and completely disoriented. "Execute," Blythe ordered. The ghosts struck. They did not fire wildly. They moved with surgical, devastating precision. Rowena opened up with the Mark 48, the heavy bursts of suppressing fire tearing through the ancient pine trunks and shredding the mercenary formation. The lack of suppressors on Team 7's weapons was deliberate. The concussive roar of the analog firearms in the tight valley created massive acoustic shock, further disorienting the tech-reliant enemy. Blythe moved through the darkness like a phantom. Covered in mud, she was completely invisible to the thermal scopes the mercenaries frantically tried to deploy. She engaged a mercenary struggling to adjust his backup optical sight. She did not aim through a scope. She pointed the barrel of her M4, feeling the alignment in her bones, and fired 2 rounds into his chest. He dropped into the dirt. Another mercenary swung his rifle toward the muzzle flash. Blythe was already gone. Dropping to a knee and pivoting, she drew a heavy, carbon steel combat knife from her chest rig. As the mercenary advanced, blinded by the flares and deafened by the gunfire, Blythe lunged upward, driving the blade under his body armor and into his ribcage. It was brutal, intimate, and completely silent. The high-tech Titan Shield squad, stripped of their digital advantages, descended into panic. Their encrypted comms were useless because Team 7 wasn't broadcasting anything to intercept. Their drones could not identify targets covered in mud. They were fighting an enemy that refused to play by modern rules. Within 4 minutes, the forest was silent again, save for the groans of the dying and the crackle of the dying magnesium flares. 20 elite, tech-enhanced mercenaries lay dead or incapacitated on the forest floor. Team 7 rallied at the edge of the tree line. Blythe did a quick physical count in the darkness. Rowena was reloading. Tamsin was securing a captured rifle. Greer was kneeling, checking her gear. Darby was standing 10 feet away, her weapon lowered, her breathing ragged. Blythe activated a dim, red lens flashlight, pointing it at the ground to preserve their night vision. The red light cast long, demonic shadows across the mud-caked faces of her team. "Report injuries," Blythe commanded softly. "Clear," Rowena said. "Clear," Tamsin echoed. Darby did not speak. She was staring at a dead mercenary near her boots. In his hand, clutched in a death grip, was a ruggedized GPS tracking device. Its screen was cracked, but a small green light was blinking steadily. Blythe stepped toward the dead man. She looked at the tracker. She looked at Darby. The tracker was not designed to locate enemies. It was a beacon, a homing signal. Blythe's mind processed the tactical data with brutal, agonizing speed. The mercenaries had not found this cabin by tracking Team 7's non-existent digital footprint. They had found it because someone had led them here. Someone had carried a beacon into the safe house. Blythe slowly raised the beam of her red flashlight, illuminating Darby's face. Darby's eyes were wide, panicked. The mud on her face could not hide the sudden, profound terror in her expression. "Check your pockets, Darby," Blythe said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. Darby hesitated. Her hand trembled as she reached into the cargo pocket of her tactical pants. She pulled out a small black plastic square, the twin to the beacon held by the dead mercenary. The silence that fell over the team was heavier than the mountain air. It was the silence of a shattered brotherhood, the sudden, violent death of absolute trust. Rowena instantly raised the barrel of her machine gun, pointing it directly at Darby's chest. Tamsin and Greer mirrored the action, their faces hardening into masks of pure hatred. In the covert operations world, betrayal was the one unforgivable sin. It demanded immediate, lethal consequence. "Stand down," Blythe ordered her team. She did not raise her voice, but the absolute authority in her tone froze them in place. Blythe stepped forward until she was inches away from Darby. "Explain," Blythe said. Darby's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at the weapons pointed at her, then up at Blythe's unreadable face. "I'm tired, Blythe," Darby whispered, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I'm so damn tired. We've been fighting in the dark for 8 years. We bleed, we die, and nobody knows our names. If we get killed out here, the Navy won't even send a flag to our families. We are nothing but ghosts." "We chose this life," Blythe said coldly. "We took the oath." "We took an oath to a man who is dead," Darby cried out, referencing Silas. "Sterling approached me. He found a way to reach me through a dead drop. He promised me a way out. He said if I gave him the team's location, he would fold us into naval intelligence. He would give us official commissions. We would have rank. We would have lives. He promised nobody would get hurt. They were just supposed to detain us." Blythe looked at the bodies of the mercenaries bleeding out into the pine needles. "Look around, Darby. Do these look like men sent to detain us? They came with suppressed weapons and body bags. Sterling lied to you. He used your fatigue to buy our execution." Darby stared at the carnage, the reality of her betrayal finally crashing down upon her. She dropped her rifle to the dirt. She fell to her knees, the fight completely draining out of her. "Do it," Darby sobbed, looking up at Blythe. "I broke the code. I sold out the team. Just do it." Blythe drew her sidearm. It was a customized 1911 pistol, heavy steel and dark wood. She racked the slide, chambering a .45 caliber round with a loud, metallic clack that echoed in the silent forest. She leveled the weapon, placing the cold steel muzzle squarely against Darby's forehead. Rowena, Tamsin, and Greer watched with grim approval. This was the law of the shadows. The penalty for treason was death, executed immediately by the commanding officer. It was a hard, ugly rule, but it was the only thing that kept them alive in a world without laws. Blythe stared down the sights of the weapon. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. She felt the pulse of her own heart. She saw the tears tracking through the mud on Darby's face. She thought about Sterling. She thought about the vice admiral sitting in a sterile, air-conditioned office in Washington, moving human lives on a digital chessboard without ever getting blood on his hands. Sterling believed that war was just data. He believed that humans were flawed, expendable assets that could be bought, sold, and manipulated by algorithms. Sterling expected Blythe to pull the trigger. He had designed the scenario to force her into a corner, to prove that analog operators were just violent, unpredictable animals who slaughtered their own when the pressure got too high. Blythe remembered her father's voice, echoing from a dusty training range years ago. Honor is not defined by who you kill, Blythe. Honor is defined by who you choose to spare when you hold absolute power over their life. Blythe's finger moved off the trigger. She slowly lowered the heavy 1911, breaking the execution posture. Rowena let out a sharp breath of surprise. "Wraith, what are you doing?" "She sold us out. She brought the executioners to our door." "I know what she did," Blythe said, her voice echoing with a profound, terrifying authority. "But if I pull this trigger, I prove Sterling right. I become the soulless, automated killing machine he thinks we are. We are not machines. We are soldiers. And soldiers are defined by their discipline." Blythe holstered her weapon. She looked down at Darby, who was staring up at her in absolute, stunned disbelief. "Get up," Blythe commanded. Darby slowly got to her feet, shaking violently. "Take off your rig," Blythe ordered. Darby unbuckled her chest rig, letting the magazines and tactical gear fall to the dirt. "You are stripped of your rank and your position within this unit," Blythe said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "You are no longer a ghost. You are no longer my sister. You wanted a normal life, Darby? You have it. Walk away." "Blythe? Out here?" Tamsin protested. "Without a weapon? It's 40 miles to the nearest town." "She has 2 legs and a compass," Blythe replied coldly. "She will survive, because if I ever see her face again, my mercy will be exhausted." Blythe stepped close to Darby, her eyes burning with an intensity that made the disgraced operator flinch. "Sterling thinks he understands how humans work," Blythe whispered fiercely. "He thinks leverage and fear are the only motivators. You go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. And when you read the news about what happens to Vice Admiral Thaddeus Sterling, you remember that it was the honor of this team that kept you breathing tonight." Darby opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg, but the absolute finality in Blythe's eyes silenced her. She turned, a solitary, broken figure, and began the long, dark walk into the trees, leaving her weapons, her team, and her honor behind in the mud. From the shadows of the cabin porch, Colonel Alastair Cromwell stepped forward. He had arrived via a covert insertion 30 minutes prior, watching the ambush and the aftermath from the darkness. He had seen the tactical brilliance of the defense, but more importantly, he had witnessed the profound moral weight of the decision Blythe had just made. He walked up to Blythe, his boots crunching on the pine needles. He looked at the retreating shadow of Darby, then at the resolute, mud-streaked face of the young team leader. In his 30 years of service, Cromwell had seen men command through fear. He had seen men command through charisma. But true leadership, the kind that forged unbreakable loyalty and defined the legacy of a warrior, was born of restraint. "Your father would be proud of you, Blythe," Cromwell said softly, his voice thick with emotion he rarely showed. "You didn't just win a gunfight tonight. You proved that the human soul is a variable no machine can ever calculate." Blythe did not smile. The mission was not over. It had barely begun. "Sterling knows we are coming now, Colonel," Blythe said, turning her gaze toward the west, where the Pacific Ocean crashed against the California coast. "He will fortify his position. He will surround himself with every technological defense his dark money can buy." "Then what is the plan, Wraith?" Cromwell asked, the old Cold War veteran ready to follow the young sniper into hell itself. Blythe reached down and picked up her M4 rifle. She checked the chamber, the mechanical click of the bolt, a comforting, analog promise in the dark. "We are going to take away his screens," Blythe said softly. "We are going to drag him out of his digital fortress, and we are going to show him what the dark really looks like." The Pacific Ocean did not care about the affairs of men. It battered the jagged, towering cliffs of the Big Sur coastline with the same mindless, catastrophic violence it had unleashed for millions of years. The water was black and freezing, churning into a violent froth of white foam against the monolithic rocks. Above the churning maelstrom, a wall of sheer granite rose straight up into the dense, suffocating coastal fog. 200 feet of vertical, unforgiving stone. At the pinnacle of this geological nightmare sat the private fortress of Vice Admiral Thaddeus Sterling. It was a masterpiece of modern architectural arrogance, a sprawling complex of steel, reinforced concrete, and tinted ballistic glass jutting out over the precipice. It was isolated from the rest of the California coast by miles of heavily wooded private property, guarded by a gauntlet of technological sentinels. Sterling had spent tens of millions of dollars of embezzled dark money securing his sanctuary. The perimeter was monitored by millimeter-wave ground radar, capable of detecting the footfalls of a coyote. The tree line was saturated with thermal imaging cameras linked directly to an artificial intelligence threat assessment network. The airspace was locked down by automated drone swarms, programmed to intercept and neutralize unauthorized aircraft. Sterling's algorithms had calculated every conceivable vector of approach by a modern military force. His computers had determined that the fortress was impenetrable, but the computers possessed a fatal flaw. They only calculated the limitations of modern soldiers. They did not account for ghosts. They did not account for the sheer, terrifying willpower of the analog warfighter. The AI had classified the 200-foot vertical cliff face dropping directly into the raging Pacific as a zero-probability threat vector. The algorithm dictated that the rock was too brittle for mechanical pitons, the wind too violent for a helicopter insertion, and the ascent entirely impossible for a human being carrying combat equipment. Blythe Stanhope hung suspended in the freezing darkness, 150 feet above the crushing waves. Her fingers dug into a microscopic fissure in the granite. She was not wearing a high-tech exoskeleton. She did not have pneumatic ascenders or motorized winches. She was dressed in a simple, skin-tight black wetsuit to ward off the hypothermia. Her feet were clad in soft-soled climbing shoes. Her hands were raw, bleeding, and heavily coated in crushed magnesium carbonate chalk. She climbed the way men had climbed before machines made them soft. She climbed with pain, with leverage, and with absolute, uncompromising discipline. Below her, moving with the same silent, methodical precision, were Greer, Tamsin, and Rowena. They were tethered together by a single, high-tensile braided nylon rope. If one of them slipped and the others could not hold the weight, they would all fall to their deaths on the jagged rocks churning in the black water below. They had accepted this reality before they ever touched the stone. It was the burden of the brotherhood. The wind howled off the ocean, carrying the bitter sting of salt spray. It tore at Blythe's hair and whipped the nylon rope against the rock face. Her forearms were burning with lactic acid, the muscles screaming for relief, vibrating with exhaustion. Every instinct in her human biology begged her to let go, to surrender to the gravity. She shut the pain out. She compartmentalized the burning in her muscles, locking it away behind a mental steel door. She focused only on the next 3 inches of rock. She reached up with her right hand, her fingertips searching the wet, freezing stone in the pitch blackness. She operated purely on tactile sensation. She found a sharp crimp in the granite, barely wide enough to accommodate the first knuckle of 3 fingers. She tested it. It held. She shifted her body weight, pressing her rubber-soled toe onto a tiny nub of rock, and drove herself upward. They climbed for 2 agonizing hours. They did not speak. They communicated through the tension in the rope, a silent language of tugs and slack that they had perfected over years of operating in the world's most hostile environments. Finally, Blythe's bleeding fingers crested the top edge of the cliff. She pulled her exhausted body over the lip of the precipice, rolling silently onto the manicured, dew-soaked grass of Sterling's private estate. She lay flat, her chest heaving as she dragged the cold night air into her lungs, the roaring of the ocean now muffled beneath her. She maintained a tight grip on the rope, bracing her body as an anchor, while Greer, then Tamsin, and finally Rowena pulled themselves over the edge. They lay in the darkness for 60 seconds, letting their heart rate slow from the threshold of cardiac failure. They had done the impossible. They had bypassed a $50 million security grid with nothing but calluses, chalk, and grit. Blythe rose to a crouch. She reached into the waterproof dry bag strapped tightly to her lower back and withdrew her weapon. It was the customized 1911 pistol. The heavy forged steel frame felt cold and reassuring in her battered hands. She racked the slide with a muted, metallic whisper, seating a heavy .45 caliber hollow point cartridge into the chamber. She checked the manual thumb safety. The mechanics of the weapon were over a century old, designed for the trenches of a forgotten war. It had no lasers, no red dot optics, no biometric locks. It simply fired a massive piece of lead with devastating reliability. She looked at her team. They were drenched in ocean spray and sweat, shivering in the coastal fog, their hands taped and bleeding. But their eyes were hard, focused, and burning with a cold, lethal intent. Blythe gave the hand signal to advance. They moved across the sprawling lawn like shadows detaching themselves from the night. Ahead of them loomed the massive glass and steel structure of the main house. The thermal cameras scanning the tree line behind the house did not see them. The cameras were not pointed at the cliff edge because the AI had deemed it mathematically impossible for a threat to originate from the ocean. They reached the perimeter of the mansion. The exterior walls were constructed of heavy, blast-resistant smart glass, designed to automatically tint and lock down in the event of an intrusion. Tamsin stepped forward. She did not pull out a laptop to hack the smart glass network. She pulled out a small, diamond-tipped glass cutter and a heavy-duty industrial suction cup. She applied the suction cup to the lower corner of a massive floor-to-ceiling pane. With practiced surgical precision, she dragged the diamond tip in a tight circle, scoring the hardened glass. She tapped the center of the scored circle with the heavy steel pommel of her combat knife. The glass cracked perfectly along the fault line. She pulled the suction cup, extracting a perfectly round 6-inch disc of glass without triggering a single acoustic or pressure sensor. Blythe reached her hand through the hole, found the manual mechanical override lever for the door latch, and threw it. The heavy door clicked open. They were inside. The interior of the fortress was a stark, minimalist display of immense wealth. Cold marble floors, brushed steel accents, and pale lighting. The silence in the house was absolute, save for the faint electronic hum of the climate control systems and the distant servers. According to the architectural blueprints Colonel Cromwell had pulled from the Pentagon's deepest archives, the central server room, the brain of Sterling's illegal, autonomous empire, was located in a reinforced sub-basement level. They moved in a staggered tactical formation, clearing the massive, empty rooms. They encountered the first security patrol near the main stairwell. There were 2 of them, elite Titan Shield mercenaries. They were fully kitted in body armor, holding suppressed short-barreled rifles, their eyes glowing with the green light of their night vision optics. They were staring intently down the hallway leading to the front gates, trusting their earpieces to warn them of any alarms. They never heard the ghosts. Blythe and Greer closed the distance in 3 silent, fluid strides. Blythe grabbed the back of the first mercenary's tactical vest, violently jerking him backward off his center of balance, while simultaneously driving the heavy steel frame of her 1911 into the base of his skull. The man crumpled to the marble floor instantly, his central nervous system shutting down from the blunt force trauma. Simultaneously, Greer swept the legs of the second mercenary, driving her knee into his chest as he hit the ground, driving the air from his lungs before he could shout, and choking him out in a blood choke that lasted exactly 6 seconds. No shots fired, no alarms triggered. Analog violence, perfectly executed. They dragged the unconscious men into a dark cloakroom and continued their descent. The sub-basement door was a slab of solid titanium, secured by a retinal scanner and a biometric palm reader. Tamsin stepped up to the door. She reached into her kit and pulled out a block of C4 plastic explosive the size of a deck of cards. She molded it directly over the biometric locking mechanism, embedding a simple chemical delay blasting cap into the center of the putty. 10 seconds, Tamsin whispered. The team stacked up on either side of the titanium door, pressing their bodies tight against the concrete walls. The explosion was a sharp, concussive crack that blew the heavy locking mechanism entirely out of its mounting bracket. Before the smoke could clear, Rowena kicked the heavy titanium slab open. Blythe went through the breach first, her 1911 leading the way, sweeping the room. The server room was massive. Row upon row of towering black server racks hummed with immense power. Thousands of blinking blue and green lights casting an eerie, synthetic glow over the subterranean bunker. The air was frigid, chilled to keep the supercomputers from melting down. This was the dark heart of Sterling's empire. The digital ledgers of stolen weapons, the source code for the autonomous drone swarms, the financial records linking dozens of corrupt politicians and flag officers to the illegal black site arms trade. At the far end of the room, sitting behind a massive desk of polished black obsidian, was Vice Admiral Thaddeus Sterling. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver hair impeccably styled, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in a subterranean bunker. He did not look surprised. He did not look terrified. He looked at Blythe with the calm, arrogant superiority of a man who believed he held all the cards. Standing beside his desk, with his hands zip-tied behind his back, was a civilian man. His face was bruised and bloodied. He was the chief logistics accountant for Sterling's smuggling ring, the only man who knew exactly where the dark money was buried. The witness. Sterling rested his right hand flat on the obsidian desk. Beneath his palm lay a small, matte black electronic device with a single, red toggle switch. A detonator. "Petty Officer Stanhope," Sterling said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of panic. "I must admit my tactical algorithms gave you a 0.01% chance of breaching this facility. I underestimated the sheer, stubborn endurance of the obsolete warfighter. I congratulate you on your physical prowess. It is quite impressive in a primitive sort of way." Blythe kept the sights of her 1911 centered squarely on the bridge of Sterling's nose. She stepped fully into the room, her team fanning out behind her to secure the flanks. "Step away from the desk, Admiral," Blythe commanded. Sterling smiled. It was a cold, reptilian expression. "I don't think I will," Sterling replied calmly. "You see, while you were clinging to a wet rock, my automated systems detected the breach the moment you blew the door. The data on these servers is currently being wiped. But more importantly, this entire sub-basement is rigged with enough military-grade, high explosives to bring this mansion down into the ocean. My thumb is currently resting on a dead man's switch." He tapped the black plastic device under his hand. "If you shoot me, my thumb relaxes. The switch engages. We all die. The witness dies. The evidence is destroyed. And the world continues to turn." Blythe did not blink. She studied the device under his hand. She studied the tension in his forearm. "You are a coward, Sterling," Blythe said, her voice echoing in the hum of the servers. "You send machines to do your killing, and you hide behind a switch. You won't blow this room. You love your own life too much." "Perhaps," Sterling conceded, his smile widening. "But are you willing to take that gamble? Are you willing to kill your team? Are you willing to vaporize the only witness who can dismantle my network just to prove a point about your archaic sense of honor?" Sterling leaned forward slightly in his leather chair. "I have a counter-proposal, Stanhope. A logical transaction between two professionals." "Pick it up," Sterling urged softly. Blythe did not take her eyes off Sterling. Rowena stepped forward, keeping her weapon shouldered, and picked up the paper. She unfolded it. She read the text, her eyes widening slightly, before stepping back and holding it up for Blythe to see, without breaking her sight picture on the Admiral. It was a set of GPS coordinates, and beneath the numbers, a time-stamped, high-resolution satellite photograph. The photograph showed a man walking down a dusty street in a war-torn city halfway across the world. He was older, his hair completely white, his face heavily bearded and scarred. But the posture, the broad shoulders, the unmistakable predatory gait, they belonged to only one man, Silas Stanhope. Reaper. He was alive. The air rushed out of Blythe's lungs. The revelation hit her like a physical blow to the chest, a sledgehammer impact that threatened to shatter her absolute, stoic control. For years, she had carried the crushing weight of his death. She had built her entire life, her entire command, around honoring the memory of a ghost. And now, the ghost was breathing. He was out there. "Your father did not die in that helicopter crash," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a persuasive, insidious purr. "He went deep underground. He went off the grid to hunt the men above me, the true architects of the Shadow Wars. He has been operating alone for years, and he is finally surrounded. He is in a city crawling with hostile intelligence operatives who are closing the net. He has perhaps 48 hours left to live before they find him." Sterling tapped his left finger on the desk. "Those coordinates pinpoint his exact current safe house. It is intelligence that no one else in the United States government possesses. I offer you a trade, Blythe. Let me stand up. Let me walk out to my helicopter on the roof. I leave the country, and I leave the servers intact. You get the evidence to clear your name. You get the witness. And most importantly, you get your father back." Sterling let the offer hang in the freezing air of the server room. "Choose, petty officer. Choose between your rigid, outdated military duty and the blood running through your veins. Save the bureaucratic system that tried to frame you, or save the man who raised you." It was the ultimate psychological torture. Sterling had bypassed her physical armor and struck directly at her soul. He was a master of leveraging human weakness, using love and loyalty as a weapon. Blythe stared at the photograph in Rowena's hand. She saw the face of the man who had taught her how to hold a rifle, how to read the wind, how to survive in a world that wanted her dead. Her heart screamed at her to take the deal, to let the corrupt admiral walk away, to let the system rot, as long as she could see her father one more time. But as she stared at the photo, the lessons of the old warfighter echoed in the silent chambers of her mind. Honor is not a transaction, Blythe. You cannot trade it away when the price gets too high. The mission is the master. We do the hard right over the easy wrong. If you compromise the mission for personal desire, you are no longer a soldier. You are just a mercenary with a grievance. Silas had not faked his death so his daughter could become corrupt. He had sacrificed his life so she could carry the fire. Blythe's eyes left the photograph. She locked her gaze back onto Sterling. The brief flicker of vulnerability vanished from her face, replaced by a cold, terrifying, absolute resolve. The resolve of a true ghost of honor. "You don't understand men like my father, Sterling," Blythe whispered, "and you don't understand me." Sterling's confident smile faltered for the very first time. He saw the shift in her eyes. He realized, with a sudden, icy spike of terror, that the leverage had failed. The analog operator was not going to break. "I'll press it," Sterling shouted, his cultured facade shattering as panic seized his voice. His thumb tensed over the red detonator switch. "I will blow us all to hell." Blythe did not speak. She did not blink. She relied on the oldest, most fundamental truth of the gunfighter. Action is faster than reaction. The human brain takes approximately a quarter of a second to process visual stimuli and send a mechanical command to the muscles. Sterling had to see her move, realize she was firing, and then consciously press down with his thumb. Blythe had already made the decision. Her right hand squeezed the heavy steel trigger of the 1911. The weapon roared. The heavy .45 caliber bullet erupted from the muzzle at 900 feet per second. It crossed the 30 feet of space between Blythe and the desk in a fraction of an eye blink. Sterling never had a chance to react. His brain never registered the muzzle flash. The bullet struck the detonator device perfectly, millimeters above Sterling's thumbnail. The massive kinetic energy of the heavy lead projectile instantly shattered the black plastic casing, obliterating the internal circuitry and snapping the red toggle switch cleanly off before the electrical contact could ever be made. The impact violently threw Sterling's hand backward off the desk, his wrist shattering from the shockwave and the grazing impact of the fragmented plastic and lead. Sterling screamed, falling backward out of his leather chair, clutching his ruined, bleeding hand to his chest, his eyes wide with absolute, disbelieving horror. Blythe slowly lowered the smoking barrel of the 1911. The echoes of the gunshot faded into the steady hum of the cooling fans. The bombs did not detonate. The fortress remained standing. "Secure the room," Blythe commanded, her voice steady and calm. Greer and Tamsin rushed forward, hauling the screaming vice admiral off the floor, throwing him brutally against the wall, and binding his hands with heavy plastic zip ties. Rowena moved to the terrified witness, cutting his bonds and securing him for extraction. Blythe walked slowly over to the obsidian desk. She looked down at the shattered remains of the detonator. She looked at the blood on the floor. Then she reached down and picked up the paper with her father's coordinates. She folded it carefully, methodically, and placed it into her breast pocket, resting it against her heart. She looked down at Sterling, who was gasping in pain on the marble floor. "Your algorithms were wrong, Admiral," Blythe said softly. "You calculated everything except the human soul." 72 hours later, the sprawling, labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. were quiet. In a highly secured, windowless briefing room deep in the sub-basement levels, far away from the press briefing rooms and the television cameras, a silent ceremony was taking place. There were no bands playing. There were no politicians making grand speeches about patriotism. There was only a long mahogany table, the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Standing at rigid attention before them was Blythe Stanhope. She wore her pristine navy dress blue uniform, the gold chevrons on her sleeve gleaming under the recessed lighting. Beside her stood Rowena, Tamsin, and Greer. The Vice Admiral's empire had collapsed in a matter of hours. The servers extracted from the Big Sur fortress had provided the Department of Justice with an irrefutable mountain of evidence. Dozens of corrupt contractors, rogue intelligence officers, and compromised flag officers were quietly arrested in the middle of the night. The Iron Shield weapons caches were secured. The threat of the autonomous Shadow Army was dismantled. The Secretary of Defense, a stern man with heavy bags under his eyes, stood up from the table. He held a small, velvet-lined box. "The United States government cannot publicly acknowledge what occurred on the California coast," the Secretary said, his voice grave. "We cannot acknowledge the existence of Team 7. To do so would compromise a decade of classified operations. Your names will not be in the history books. You will not receive parades." He walked around the table and stopped in front of Blythe. He opened the box. Resting on the dark velvet was the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor in combat. "But within these walls," the Secretary continued, his eyes meeting Blythe's with profound respect, "we know what you did. You held the line when the system failed. You chose duty over desire. You are the truest embodiment of the American warfighter." He pinned the heavy bronze cross to Blythe's uniform. He moved down the line, pinning identical medals to the chests of the remaining ghosts. "Return to the shadows, petty officer," the Secretary said. "The nation still needs its ghosts." "Yes, sir," Blythe replied. The ceremony ended as quietly as it began. They were dismissed. Blythe walked down the long, echoing marble corridor of the Pentagon basement. As she approached the secured exit doors, a figure stepped out from the shadows of an alcove. It was Colonel Alistair Cromwell. He was wearing his Class A uniform, the heavy stack of ribbons on his chest, a testament to a lifetime of silent wars. He fell into step beside her. They walked in silence for a moment, the rhythmic clicking of their polished shoes the only sound. "You made the hardest choice a soldier can make in that room, Blythe," Cromwell said quietly, staring straight ahead. "You let go of Silas to save the mission. That takes a kind of strength most men never find." Blythe touched her breast pocket, where the folded paper with the coordinates still rested. "I did what he trained me to do, Colonel, but I am going to find him. Now that the mission is over, I am going to pull him out of whatever hell he is trapped in." Cromwell stopped walking. He turned to face her. The hard, weathered lines of his face softened into something resembling a grandfatherly smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an object. He handed it to her. Blythe looked down at her palm. It was an old, brass-cased military compass, the kind issued to infantrymen in Vietnam. It was heavily scratched, the brass worn smooth by years of handling. "Your father didn't need you to rescue him, Blythe," Cromwell said softly. Blythe frowned, looking from the compass to the colonel. "What do you mean? Sterling said he was trapped, surrounded." "Sterling only knew what we allowed him to know," Cromwell replied. "Sterling was a paranoid man. He hid behind his drones and his algorithms. He never stepped into the light. The only way to expose his entire network was to make him feel so desperate, so cornered, that he had to act personally. We had to bait the trap." Blythe's mind, always operating at tactical speed, began to process the implications of Cromwell's words. She thought back to the cabin in the mountains, the tracker, the betrayal. "Darby," Blythe whispered, the realization washing over her like cold water. Cromwell nodded slowly. "Darby never broke the code, Wraith. She is one of the finest operators I have ever seen. She approached me 6 months ago. She knew there was a mole in naval intelligence hunting your team. Together, she and I built the narrative of the exhausted, compromised ghost. We fed that narrative to Sterling's dead drops. We let him recruit her." "The tracker at the cabin," Blythe said, her voice barely a breath. "A necessary piece of theater," Cromwell said. "We had to make Sterling believe he had won, that he had broken your team. We had to force you to react. If you had known Darby was a double agent, your reaction wouldn't have been genuine. Sterling's behavioral analysis algorithms would have flagged the deception. It had to be real. You had to experience the betrayal, and you had to make the choice to spare her life. That proved to Sterling that he could manipulate your morality." Blythe stared at the old man. The audacity of the deception was staggering. It was an old-school, Cold War, double-blind intelligence operation, executed flawlessly in the digital age. "And my father?" Blythe asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Open the compass," Cromwell instructed. Blythe unlatched the brass lid. The needle spun freely under the cracked glass. "Unscrew the bezel ring." Blythe twisted the grooved brass ring holding the glass in place. It unthreaded smoothly. She lifted the glass away. Resting on the very tip of the magnetic needle was a tiny, microscopic speck of black film. A microdot, the oldest, most secure method of analog data transfer in the espionage world. Unhackable, untraceable. "Silas has been hunting the rot in the Pentagon for 6 years, Cromwell said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble. Sterling was just a middleman, a symptom of a much deeper disease. Silas needed Sterling removed to clear the board, to force the true architects of this corruption out of hiding. He needed his daughter to strike the hammer blow." Blythe stared at the microscopic dot on the needle. Her father was not a victim. He was the mastermind. He was the ghost pulling the strings of the men who thought they ran the world. "What is on the microdot, Colonel?" Blythe asked. Cromwell looked down the long, shadowed corridor of the Pentagon, looking at the closed doors hiding the nation's darkest secrets. "The coordinates Sterling gave you were real, Blythe, but they aren't a rescue location. They are a rally point." Cromwell looked back into her eyes, the fire of the old wars burning bright in his gaze. "Your father is waiting for you. Sterling was just a training exercise. The real war to clean out this building, it starts tomorrow. Blythe Stanhope closed the brass lid of the compass. The heavy weight of grief that she had carried for years evaporated, replaced by the hardened, absolute focus of a soldier receiving a new set of orders. She was not a relic. She was not obsolete. She was the ghost the system could not control. She slipped the compass into her pocket, squared her shoulders, and walked out of the Pentagon, stepping back into the shadows where she belonged.